I told myself it was nothing. Just a glance, a fleeting accidental meeting of eyes in a quiet house. But when I walked past him that morning, wearing something I shouldn't have, his gaze followed me, slow and deliberate. It wasn't just curiosity, it was something deeper. Something I felt in the air between us, like an unspoken challenge. And for the first time in years, I didn't know if I wanted to step back or step closer. It was a Sunday morning, the kind of quiet day I used to enjoy. The house was still, the faint sound of birds outside the only noise. And I was savoring the rare stillness. Ethan had been staying with me for a few weeks now, filling the space James had left behind in ways I hadn't expected. I thought it would be temporary, just until he figured out his next steps after finishing grad school. But even in such a short time, his presence had changed the house, brought life back into it. And I hated to admit, brought something else back into me. That morning I hadn't thought much about what I was wearing. A silk robe one James had bought me years ago, the kind that clung to the skin in soft waves. It wasn't revealing, not exactly. But it was more intimate than anything I usually wore around the house. I wasn't expecting to see Ethan at that hour, assuming he'd still be asleep. But as I walked out of my room, a cup of tea in hand, there he was standing at the end of the hallway. He was leaning against the wall barefoot, a mug in one hand. The faint smile on his lips froze the moment I stepped into view. His gaze drifted over me, lingering just a second too long before meeting mine. "Morning," he said. His voice casual, but his eyes gave him away. "Good morning," I replied quickly, clutching the tea like a lifeline and moving past him. I could feel his gaze follow me, heat rising in my cheeks as I escaped into the kitchen. My heart was pounding in a way I couldn't explain, my body hyper-aware of the encounter. It was nothing, I told myself again. Just a look. But that look stayed with me all day. Ethan had always been polite, reserved, even he was nothing like James, who was brash and charming and knew how to command a room. Ethan was quieter, more thoughtful, the kind of person who listened before he spoke. It had taken years for him to warm up to me. When James and I first married, by the time he left for college, we'd settled into a comfortable, if distant, understanding of each other. But the man who returned to my house after James's death wasn't the same boy who'd left. Ethan had grown into himself. He was confident now, more self-assured. And there was something about him that unsettled me, in a way I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just his looks, though. I'd be lying if I said I hadn't noticed his broad shoulders, the sharp line of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled slightly when he smiled. It was all impossible to ignore. But it was more than that. It was the way he filled the house. His presence, quiet but undeniable. The way he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. And now, with that lingering look from the hallway replaying in my mind, I felt like something had shifted. I tried to shake it off as the day went on, throwing myself into tasks I didn't really need to do. I cleaned the kitchen twice, reorganized the pantry, even spent an hour in the garden pulling weeds. But no matter how hard I worked, I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. That evening we sat down for dinner together, something we'd fallen into the habit of doing since he'd moved in. The conversation was light, easy, but I couldn't help noticing the way his eyes lingered on me when I spoke. "You've been busy today," he said, his tone casual as he leaned back in his chair. I shrugged, keeping my gaze fixed on my plate. "Just trying to stay productive." His lips quirked into a small smile. "You don't always have to keep yourself busy." You know, the comment caught me off guard. I looked up, meeting his gaze across the table. "What do you mean?" "Nothing," he said quickly. But his expression softened. "It's just you deserve to take a break." Sometimes the way he said it, so sincere and gentle, left me momentarily speechless. I forced a smile, changing the subject quickly. But his words lingered long after dinner was over. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the way Ethan had looked at me in the hallway that morning. The intensity of his gaze, the way it had made me feel both vulnerable and alive at the same time. It was a feeling I hadn't expected, one I wasn't sure I wanted. But it was there, undeniable. And no amount of reasoning could make it go away. The days that followed were a careful dance, though I wasn't sure who was leading. I told myself to keep my distance, to maintain the boundaries that had always been there. But Ethan's presence was magnetic. And no matter how hard I tried, I found myself drawn to him in ways I couldn't explain or justify. It started with the little things. He began joining me in the garden, offering to help pull weeds or trim back the hedges that had grown wild since James passed. At first I thought it was just politeness, a way for him to pass the time. But then there were the moments that lingered. The ones that felt like they meant something more. One afternoon I was kneeling in the dirt, tugging at a stubborn weed, when Ethan crouched beside me. His hands were rougher than I expected as they brushed against mine. "Taking hold of the same route here," he said softly. "Let me." I let go, watching as his strong hands worked the weed free from the soil. When he looked up at me, there was a faint smile on his lips, and I felt a strange flutter in my chest. "You make it look easy," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "It's all about the angle," he replied, his smile widening for a moment. We just looked at each other, the sunlight casting golden highlights in his hair. I cleared my throat, breaking the silence. "Thanks," I murmured, turning back to the garden. But I could feel his gaze on me, and it made my hands tremble. That evening after dinner, we sat together in the living room. The storm outside had settled into a steady rain, the sound of it tapping against the windows. Ethan was stretched out on the couch, flipping idly through a book, while I sat in the armchair with a cup of tea. "I don't know how you stay so calm," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. I looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" He closed the book, his gaze meeting mine. "This house. It's so quiet, doesn't it ever get overwhelming?" I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the mug. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But I'm used to it." Ethan nodded, leaning forward slightly. "I don't think I could do it. I need noise, movement. Something to keep my mind busy." I smiled faintly. "That's why you're always fixing things, isn't it?" He chuckled. Maybe there was a pause, the kind that felt heavy with unspoken words. "I didn't mean to bring it up," he said finally, his tone softer. I don't know, I feel like you deserve more than this." The sincerity in his voice took me off guard. I stared at him, unsure how to respond. "More than what?" This, he said, gesturing vaguely around the room. "This quiet, this loneliness. You deserve to feel alive." The word hit me like a jolt, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. "I'm fine, Ethan," I said quickly, setting the mug down and standing. "You don't need to worry about me." But as I walked past him, I could feel his eyes on me, steady and unflinching. The next day, I found Ethan in the garage, sorting through a pile of old tools that had belonged to James. He looked up when I stepped inside, his expression softening. "Need something?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "No," I said, hesitating in the doorway. "I just wanted to see what you were up to." He smiled, setting down the wrench he was holding. "Just trying to make sense of all this. Your husband kept everything." I stepped closer, my eyes scanning the shelves lined with jars of nails and screws, half-empty cans of paint and tools that hadn't been touched in years. "He always said you never know when you might need something," I said softly. Ethan laughed. "Sounds like him." For a moment we stood in silence, the weight of James's absence settling over us. Then Ethan turned to me, his gaze steady. "Do you miss him?" The question caught me off guard, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. "Every day," I admitted. Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. "I do too." I looked at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. "He don't talk about him much." He shrugged, his eyes dropping to the floor. "It's hard. He wasn't around a lot when I was growing up. But he tried in his own way." "He loved you," I said quietly. Ethan looked up, his eyes meeting mine. "I know," he said. "And I think he'd want you to be happy." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and unspoken. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, my chest tight with emotions I couldn't name. That evening, as I stood in the kitchen washing dishes, I felt Ethan's presence before I heard him. He stepped into the room, leaning against the counter as he watched me. "You don't have to do all that," he said, his voice low. "I don't mind," I replied, not looking at him. There was a pause, the kind that made the air between us feel heavy. "Elise," he said softly, and the way he said my name made me stop. I turned to him, my heart pounding. What? He hesitated, his gaze searching mine. "You don't always have to do it alone." I didn't know what to say. The sincerity in his voice. The way he looked at me, it was too much. I turned back to the sink, my hands trembling as I picked up a plate. But his words stayed with me long after he left the room. I couldn't stop thinking about what Ethan had said the night before. "You don't always have to do it alone." The words had settled into my chest like a weight impossible to ignore. I'd spent so many years convincing myself that I was fine, that I didn't need anyone. But now with Ethan here, that lie felt harder to maintain. He was in the house more than usual that week, working on small projects he'd taken upon himself, fixing a broken cabinet door, organizing the tools in the garage. His presence was steady grounding, and yet it left me feeling unmoored. One night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the house fell into its usual stillness, I found myself wandering into the living room. Ethan was there, sprawled across the couch, his long legs stretched out and a book resting on his chest. The soft glow of the lamp cast shadows across his face, and for a moment I just stood there watching him. "Can't sleep?" he asked. His voice low and quiet. I shook my head, stepping further into the room. "Not really." He sat up, placing the book on the coffee table. "Want to sit?" I hesitated for only a moment, before sinking into the armchair across from him. The silence between us was heavy, the kind that felt like it was waiting for someone to break it. "I was thinking about James today," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "What about him? Just how he used to fill this house. It feels so quiet without him." Ethan's gaze was steady, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. "It doesn't feel quiet to me," he said softly. I looked at him, my breath catching in my throat. There was something in his tone, something in the way he looked at me, that made the air between us feel charged. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. When he stood crossing the room to kneel in front of my chair, my heart leapt into my throat. His hand reached for mine, his touch warm and steady. "Elise," he said my name, a quiet plea on his lips. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice trembling. He looked at me like he was trying to memorize my face, his thumb brushing over the back of my hand. "Tell me I'm not imagining this," he said, his voice raw. I couldn't say it because it wasn't true. I wasn't imagining it, and neither was he. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice breaking. "Neither do I," he said, "but I can't stop thinking about you. About us." The word sent a shiver through me, and before I could stop myself, my free hand reached up to touch his face. His eyes fluttered shut for a moment, and when they opened again, they were filled with so much longing it made my chest ache. "Ethan, we can't," I started, but the words felt hollow even as I said them. "Why not?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. "Because it was wrong. Because it was complicated. Because it could ruin everything." But none of those reasons felt strong enough to make me pull away. The next day I did everything I could to avoid him. I threw myself into chores, cleaning rooms that didn't need cleaning, and reorganizing the pantry for the third time that month. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the memory of his touch, the way he'd looked at me like I was the only thing that mattered. By mid-afternoon the tension was unbearable. I found myself in the study, rearranging books on the shelves, in a desperate attempt to keep my hands busy. "Do you need help with that?" Ethan's voice came from the doorway, and I jumped, the book in my hand slipping to the floor. "No," I said quickly, bending to pick it up. "I've got it." He stepped into the room, his presence filling the space in a way that made it hard to breathe. "Elise, we need to talk." "I don't think that's a good idea," I said, turning back to the shelves. "Why not?" he asked, his tone gentle but insistent. "Because," I trailed off, my hands trembling as I placed the book on the shelf. "Because you're scared," he said. Stepping closer, I turned to face him, my back against the bookshelf. "Of course I'm scared," I said, my voice rising. This isn't supposed to happen." "But it did," he said, his voice calm and pretending it didn't. "Won't make it go away." I opened my mouth to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped me. He stepped closer, his hands bracing against the shelf on either side of me, trapping me in place. "Elise," he said softly, his voice a whisper against my skin, "just tell me you don't feel the same and I'll walk away." I couldn't say it because it wasn't true. Instead I reached up, my hand trembling as it rested against his chest. "I don't know what to do," I said, my voice breaking. "You don't have to do anything," he said, leaning in until our foreheads touched. "Just let me in," and I did. That evening the storm returned, rain pounding against the windows as thunder rolled in the distance. We sat on the couch together, the silence between us heavy but not uncomfortable. "Do you regret it?" "Yes." Suddenly his voice low. I looked at him, my chest tightening. "No," I said honestly. He nodded, his expression softening. "Neither do I." The tension between us was still there, but it felt different now. Less like a burden and more like a promise. When he reached for my hand, I didn't pull away, and when he leaned in, pressing his lips to mine, I didn't stop him. The house was quiet that night, the storm outside subsiding into a steady drizzle. I sat in the living room, a book in my lap. Though I hadn't turned a page in over an hour, my mind was elsewhere, on him, on the moments we'd shared, on the way his gaze made me feel like I was coming undone. I heard his footsteps before I saw him. Ethan walked into the room, his presence filling the space in a way that was impossible to ignore. He was barefoot, his shirt slightly wrinkled, and there was a quiet intensity in his expression that made my heart race. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low. I shook my head, setting the book aside. "No, you?" he shrugged, leaning against the doorway. "Not really," for a moment. Neither of us spoke. The air between us felt charged, thick with everything we hadn't said. "Ethan," I began, but he interrupted me. "Can I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the spot beside me on the couch. I hesitated, my chest tightening, but I nodded. He sat down, leaving just enough space between us to make the silence feel unbearable. I could feel the heat of him, the way his presence seemed to draw me in like gravity. "We need to talk," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. I turned to him, my breath catching in my throat. "About what?" "You know what?" he said, his gaze meeting mine. I looked away, my hands twisting in my lap. "I don't know if I can." "Yes, you can," he said, gently reaching out to take my hand in his. His touch was warm, steady, grounding. "Just tell me how you feel." I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. "It's complicated," I said finally. "I don't care," he replied, his voice soft but resolute. I looked up at him, my eyes burning with unshed tears. "It's not that simple, Ethan." "It's wrong." "Why?" he asked, his thumb brushing over the back of my hand. "Because other people might not understand. Because it scares you." "Because it scares me too, Elise. But I can't stop thinking about you. I can't stop wanting you." His words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. I felt my walls cracking, the carefully constructed defenses I'd built over years of loneliness beginning to crumble. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice trembling. He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine. "Just tell me to stop," he murmured. "If you don't feel the same, just say the word and I'll leave you alone." But if you do, I couldn't say it. I couldn't tell him to stop because I didn't want him to. Instead, I closed the distance between us, my lips brushing against his in a tentative kiss. It was soft, hesitant, but the second his hand came up to cut my cheek, it deepened. Years of longing, of loneliness, of denying myself the chance to feel alive again, all of it poured into that kiss. His hands were gentle but insistent, his touch igniting something in me I thought had died a long time ago. We didn't make it upstairs right away. The living room became a blur of soft whispers and quiet gasps, our movements slow and deliberate, as we explored the boundaries we'd both been too afraid to cross. By the time we made it to my bedroom, the rain outside had picked up again, the sound of it tapping against the windows, as lightning flashed in the distance. Ethan paused at the doorway, his gaze searching mine. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," I said, the word leaving my lips without hesitation. The next moments unfolded with a tenderness that took my breath away. Ethan's touch was reverent, his movements deliberate, as if he was afraid I might vanish if he wasn't careful. I let myself surrender to him, to the way he made me feel seen and wanted in a way I hadn't in years. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional. A connection that felt impossibly deep, like we were both finding something we hadn't even realized we'd lost. When it was over, we lay tangled together beneath the sheets, the room bathed in the soft glow of the storm outside. Ethan's arm was draped over my waist, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my skin. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice breaking the quiet. I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. Yes, I said softly. He pressed a kiss to my forehead. Pulling me closer, I meant what I said. He murmured, I don't care how complicated it is. I just want to be with you. Tears stung my eyes and I buried my face against his chest. I don't know what happens next. I admitted, my voice trembling. We'll figure it out, he said. His tone steady, one step at a time. I woke before the sun. The house still shrouded in the soft gray light of dawn. For a moment I stayed still, listening to the rhythmic sound of Ethan's breathing beside me. His arm was draped over my waist, his warmth a steady presence against the cool morning air. The events of the night before felt like a dream, fragile and surreal. But the weight of his hand on my hip and the way his chest rose and fell told me it was real. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, relief, guilt, fear, and something dangerously close to joy. I slipped out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake him, pulling on my robe. I padded to the kitchen, the floorboards creaking softly beneath my feet. The house felt different this morning, quieter in a way that wasn't unsettling, but peaceful. I brewed a pot of coffee, the scent filling the air as I leaned against the counter, staring out the window. The garden glistened with dew, the daisies Ethan had teased me about, still standing tall in the early light. Last night I had let my guard down completely, and now I wasn't sure how to put it back up. Everything felt so precarious, like I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't fully see. Morning. His voice startled me and I turned to see him standing in the doorway. His hair was tousled, his t-shirt slightly wrinkled, and there was a softness in his eyes that made my chest ache. Good morning, I said, my voice quieter than I intended. He walked over to the counter, pouring himself a cup of coffee, before leaning against the opposite side of the kitchen island. For a moment we just stood there, the silence between us filled with everything we hadn't said. Are you okay? He asked finally. His tone careful. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was the truth. Are you? He smiled faintly, setting his mug down. I am if you are. The simplicity of his words made my throat tighten, and I looked down at the counter, my fingers tracing the edge of the mug in my hands. I don't know what happens now, I admitted. Neither do I, he said, his voice steady. But I don't regret it, Elise. Not for a second. I looked up at him, his words sinking into my chest like a bong. I don't regret it either, I said softly. The relief in his expression was palpable, and he stepped around the island, closing the distance between us. His hand found mine, his fingers intertwining with mine as he squeezed gently. We'll figure it out, he said, his voice calm and sure. I nodded, holding onto his hand like it was the only thing keeping me steady. Later that morning I sat on the porch with my second cup of coffee, the sunlight warming my skin as I watched Ethan in the garden. He was pulling weeds, his movements deliberate as he worked to tame the wild overgrowth. The sight of him there, so natural and at ease, brought a small smile to my lips. The guilt wasn't gone, it lingered at the edges of my mind, a quiet reminder of the line we'd crossed. But alongside it was something else, something I hadn't felt in years: hope. The path ahead of us was uncertain, filled with questions I didn't have the answers to. But for the first time I wasn't afraid to face it. As I sat there, the sound of birds in the distance, and the gentle hum of the world waking up, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, it was okay to feel alive again.